You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Examined Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours. So first off, before I get to anything else, my apologies that I missed an episode last week. As I've mentioned a couple other times on the podcast here, it's been extraordinarily difficult for me to find any kind of quiet time at all in the house with this ongoing lockdown and pandemic, as I've got my daughter just turned 4 this last week, and my son's only about a year and a half old, and they're both really, really loud, and they're around all the time. And so, this morning, I got up an hour and a half earlier than I normally do, than before anyone else does, and made myself some coffee, and hopefully that'll give me some time to record the podcast here before everybody wakes up and all the yelling starts, because, hey, that's what a 4-year-old and a 1.5-year-old do when they play together, is just constantly yell at each other. At least that's what my kids do. Maybe it's not what everyone's kids do, but it's what mine do. So my apologies for that. Hopefully getting up early will work as far as settling that. So this week, I want to just briefly bring up and discuss a very well-known and very central problem in philosophy that's called the problem of universals. Now, if you haven't actually studied philosophy in any kind of in-depth setting before, you probably haven't heard this. It's something that you will get introduced to very quickly when you study philosophy. As soon as you start getting beyond introductory texts and Philosophy 101 classes, this is going to come up very, very quickly. And it is very important and very central, and how you come down on the problem of universals will actually then turn around and dictate what you think about a lot of other very key and very important questions. But as I said, if you only took a Philosophy 101 class or read a just introductory book, they probably wouldn't come up. But before I do that, I'd like to give out another Facepalm and Sigh award, because it seems like it's been quite a while since I've done that. It seems like I keep getting away from doing these, even though I really, really enjoy them. So the context of this one is it's from the third season of that very popular podcast Serial. My wife and I have listened to the first 2 seasons, and then about a month and a half or so ago, right before this lockdown started, I was heading up to Minnesota to see my grandma, who's dying of mesothelioma, so she's probably not going to be around much longer. I managed to get up there and get in and see her literally right before the lockdown started, fortunately. In fact, when I got back, the very next week, my wife and I were talking about it, saying, if I'd planned on going to see her this week, it would have probably been, I still could have legally done it because states hadn't locked down yet, but we kind of decided the risk would have been too great that I would have been maybe giving her the coronavirus or something like that. The risk just would have been too high, so I wouldn't have gone that week. So I got up there and saw her right in the nick of time, right before it was time to hunker down and try and wait this thing out. Well, anyhow, on the way back, I was looking for some stuff to listen to, because it's like a 12, 13-hour drive from where my parents and my grandparents live down to Missouri here where I live. And on the way back, I realized there was a third season of this Serial podcast that I hadn't listened to before. And it was popular for the first season because it did kind of a true crime story. The second season, they talked about that Bo Bergdahl guy who was a sort of kind of a deserter in Afghanistan that President Obama then traded some prisoners for. And I say sort of kind of because that's what it was trying to call into question. No, well, the third season, they just did a bunch of stories about the criminal justice system in America, focusing on a specific location in, I think it was Ohio. And if you are interested in these kind of things, I will say before I introduce what the problem here is, that the third season is well worth your time to listen to if you're interested in how the criminal justice system works or does not work. They do cover some interesting stories and go into a lot of facets of it, so it's worth your time to listen to. So despite the fact that I'm going to give the journalist, the woman who runs the Serial podcast, Sarah Kainer, Facepalm and Sigh award, it is worth your time to engage with the third season of Serial. It was a fairly well-done podcast that explored a lot of things in depth. And just because I'm able to pick out a couple of instances where she made this same mistake over and over again, it doesn't mean the rest of it isn't worthwhile. So I'm going to go ahead and play a clip for you from the very first episode of Season 3 of Serial. It's actually very close to the beginning, that just illustrates this problem quite well.
This place is primarily black and white. The majority of the courthouse staff is black. Clerks are mostly black. Most of their managers are white. In the sheriff's department, most of the security guards are black. Most of the deputies are white. Most of the attorneys are white. Almost all the county judges are white, and their bailiffs are white. Most of the defendants and crime victims are black. In the cocoon of the elevator, everyone's polite to each other, pretends nothing is weird about this. But if the elevators were calibrated to detect a power imbalance in the load, like a socially conscious clothes dryer, they'd be perpetually on the fritz.
Now, there's several other points in this season of Serial where she makes kind of the same inference, same complaint, same observation, whatever you want to call it, which is more or less, hey, there's all these white people who are running the criminal justice system, and all the black people and minorities are either the defendants getting dragged in, or they're the people doing the, what you might want to call, manual labor type work of it. That is, they're the officers, but they're the bailiffs. They're not the judges, so to speak. She gives stats at some point later on where she goes through and lists how the vast majority of the judges who are at this particular courthouse are white, Caucasian, and there's very few who are blacks, people, or other minorities. Now, the obvious inference that she wants you to draw from what she's saying there is that there's something wrong with this, that there's something racist about the idea that, well, hey, everybody who's kind of running things here seems to more or less not be minorities, or at least most of the people who are running the criminal justice system at that particular courthouse in Ohio seem to not be minorities. It seems very clear to me that that's what the inference she wants you to draw from her statements about the power imbalance is, hey, racism, or something along those lines. And as I said, she makes the same inference a couple other times over the course of the season of the podcast. I didn't track down all of those clips. As I said, I listened to this while I was driving on the interstate, so it wasn't like I was taking notes or something along those lines. And I found it a little ironic that she was making this kind of inference in a podcast series that was all about the criminal justice system, because she spends a lot of time going into detailing how, well, they use different terms they use the terms of, like, when you have probable cause when the cops have probable cause to arrest or stop someone, what it takes to get somebody indicted, what it takes to convict someone, and they use different terms in the criminal justice system, but that's really all that is about warrant. That is, what justifies you in believing something. In this case, what justifies the cops in believing that person committed a crime so they can arrest them, what justifies the grand jury in indicting somebody so there can be an investigation or somebody can be arrested, and what justification is there for a jury in deciding that there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt that this person committed the crime. And the idea there, at least in theory, is you have a increasing level of justification or warrant. That is, you need a lot more justification or warrant for a jury to decide somebody's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt than you do for a grand jury to indict someone, or for a cop to have probable cause to, say, stop a car and start a little bit of a question and answer investigation session into what somebody's doing. And at least in principle, it seems obvious that that's a good way to run things. You obviously can't demand the same level of proof from a police officer as whether or not he's going to stop that car as you demand a jury to take into account when they're deciding, should this person go spend the rest of their life in prison. And a large part of the reason why I like listening to true crime series, watching documentaries about these kind of things, is because it really does get into that principle of, what's your warrant? What's your justification for believing this? Is there a threshold that's been crossed when you have a certain amount of evidence? And what kind of evidence is it? And all those interesting questions that epistemology deals with, and I like to study. And that's one of the reasons why I enjoy listening to podcasts like Serial or other true crime things, is because it's trying to look at, even though the people who run these kind of things wouldn't use these terms and probably wouldn't realize it's philosophically relevant, it's exploring, well, what are you justified in believing, when, and why, which are questions of epistemology. So, back to her observation about how pretty much everybody in that Ohio courthouse who runs things are not black people and not minorities, and at least it seems to her from her observations, and I think they spent a year or so there, so I'd say her observations are probably fairly close to spot on and worth taking seriously, that the majority of the people who were defendants or criminals who were getting prosecuted there were probably minorities or black people. Well, I think it's pretty obvious that, based on her comments, that the inference she wants us to draw from this observation is, aha, racism. And she makes other comments about it elsewhere in the season as well. Well, is that a justified inference between, as she observed, the power imbalance between the ethnicities, between the races there? Well, in this case, I would want to say, well, no, it's obviously not. And part of the reason this caught my attention is you hear people in media or tending to be on the left side of politics making this inference jump all the time, which is, hey, there's a lot of white or Caucasian people here, there's not very many minorities here, aha, racism. And not really, not necessarily, maybe, but not necessarily. That's a fallacy of a hasty generalization. She's taking some facts that could be explained by racism, but also could be explained by many other things, and then jumping right to racism. Now, to be a little fair to Sarah Keenan, at the very last episode of the season, she does start referencing various studies that she says prove that there is racism in the criminal justice system, but she also doesn't go in depth in any of them and cite them or explain them or anything along those lines. And I was kind of disappointed that she didn't do that because, well, this is a 9-episode podcast where you've got about an hour to talk about more or less whatever they want to talk about each time. And if you can't go in depth there, then where can you? I mean, that's one of the reasons why I try and do this podcast at a format of roughly like 45 minutes to an hour, so I can try to go more in depth. That's the whole point of that. So I was kind of miffed that she didn't do that because, hey, that would have really supported her earlier inference that she wants us to draw of, aha, racism. So since this was a podcast about the criminal justice system, let me borrow language from that most people are probably more familiar with rather than language from epistemology and explain what's going on here. The fact that there is this, what she termed power imbalance, and I see no reason to doubt that that is the case in Ohio and in many other places in the country, the fact that that is there does not in itself give you proof beyond a reasonable doubt that there's racism there. I think it would give you probable cause to say, maybe there's racism here. We should investigate this further. We should look into this in more depth. Because the fact that there is a gross imbalance in power, well, that could be caused by racism. That's a possible explanation. But there's other possible explanations, too. There's socioeconomic explanations. There's preference explanations. It could well be the case, although this seems unlikely, but it could well be the case that for whatever reason, in that particular area of the country, the vast majority of minorities don't want to pursue careers in the legal field, so they don't wind up being judges and people with power there at the courthouse, where, for whatever reason, white people do. Now, I don't think that's a very good explanation, because then you'd want to turn around and ask, well, why are those preferences there, and dig a little deeper. But there's an explanation that's possible that isn't racism. And it's very, very easy to turn around and find many other explanations as to why this imbalance exists that have nothing to do with racism and have everything to do with other factors. There's a whole lot more variables that you have to weed out before you can then turn around and go, aha, racism. And that's what the fallacy of the hasty generalization is. It's where you take some facts that could be explained in a multitude of ways and jump to one conclusion. It's really a jumping to conclusions before you've done your research and done your due diligence. And based on the comments that she made at the end of the season, it seems to me like she did some research, but she didn't actually cite it or reference it or point listeners like me to it so we could go look it up. So really, in the context of the podcast, you have to say, well, this is a hasty generalization. From the fact that there is a power imbalance, it doesn't necessarily follow that there is racism. And part of the reason why I wanted to do this Facepalm and Sigh Award is that this is just a claim, a jump that I see people doing all the time in media and pretty much all over the place in our culture of saying, well, there's an imbalance there, therefore there's an injustice. And no, not necessarily. It could be that there's an injustice, to borrow the legal terminology. If there's an imbalance, you've got probable cause to look for an injustice, and in this case, racism. But it might turn out that there really isn't any injustice there at all. There could be a whole host of other reasons why that is the case, why there's that imbalance. Good good example of this is you often hear, especially politicians, cry about how there's a wage gap between what men make and what women make, and that's therefore unjust, therefore sexism. But when you actually do your due diligence, go in and try and look at the other variables and weed them out, what you find is that, well, men tend to work longer hours, take more overtime, work in more dangerous jobs that pay more, and on top of that, women tend to take more time off to be with their families because women, unlike men, have the sensible idea that it's a good idea to spend time with your families, at least generally so. And therefore, when you control for all those other variables, the so-called wage gap reduces to basically a statistical anomaly. Therefore, you don't have cause to say there's sexism because there's other explanations that explain why there's that apparent wage gap that have nothing to do with sexism. Now, even on top of that, you could still find instances of sexism in particular examples as to why this woman didn't get the raise while this man did, and in particular fields and other examples along those lines. But the point being, you have to actually do the hard work of going in and examining the details, weeding out all the variables before you can then turn around and go, aha, racism, aha, sexism. Just because you're driving a car at 3 a.m. in the middle of the night in an area of a city where there's usually lots of crime, the cops aren't allowed to go, aha, you're committing a crime. No, you could probably make a case they might have probable cause to stop you, especially if you're speeding or something, but they can't, or at least they shouldn't, legally anyway, be allowed to jump right from the fact of the matter that you're in a situation that gives them probable cause to suspect something's wrong to, aha, you're committing a crime. Same thing. You don't get to just jump from a power imbalance to, aha, racism, aha, injustice. You've got to do the hard work, and that's why it's a hasty generalization. So, for this hasty generalization, I'm giving Sarah Koenig the Facepalm and Sigh Award, because this is a pretty obvious error that people make all the time. You've really got to do your due diligence and actually do the work before you can say, aha, there's an injustice here. And my apologies if I've mispronounced her last name. As I've said many times, I'm just terrible with last names. And hers seems to be pronounced in a little bit of a different way than it's spelled, so that made it even harder on me, like when I'm trying to pronounce all those ancient Greek philosophers' names and stuff like that. Okay, so on to the problem of universals. Now, I've referenced this a little bit before in the podcast when I talked about Aristotle and Plato, and I divided their philosophy mostly based on actually how they responded to the problem of universals, but I didn't actually go through and explain in depth what the problem of universals is. So I'm going to go through and just do my best to explain what it is and why this is an important thing for you to think about if you want to do any kind of serious philosophy. So, the problem of universals is a metaphysical discussion concerning the objective ontological status of essence that are perceived universally by the intellect and that seem to exist in many individuals. And really, that's just a rather technical philosophical way of saying that we all perceive what are termed universals, and the question of the problem of universals is, well, what are these? Whence from they come, and what's the foundation of them? So a universal is something like the color blue. That is, we all see the color blue everywhere, but the problem is you never see the color blue by itself. You always see the color blue like on a car, the water, on a building that's painted blue, or something else that's colored blue. You never see the color blue in and of itself apart from something else. And every universal is like that. It's something that's always observed as a property of something else. Hence, is there really a color blue? Because you've never seen it apart from something else. So does the property exist apart from the thing? Is there a color blue apart from the fact that the water is blue, that car is blue, that building is blue, sometimes the sky is blue, and so on and so forth? Is there really that color blue? Now, typically the common sense answer would be to say, well, yeah, it seems pretty clear and commonsensical that universals exist because it seems quite equally clear that we're just see and experience them all the time. A good example of this that's very relevant right now since I got up very early to record this is, I make and drink coffee almost every day, and sometimes I will vary the type of coffee bean I use or the brand I use, And sometimes these changes will noticeably change the taste and flavor of the coffee. Like, for example, it might get more or less bitter. And sometimes there isn't really a noticeable change from this, or any change that there is so minute that I just can't detect it and other people might be able to detect it because they might have more sophisticated coffee palates than I do. Yet, through all these changes, that is, I can give you like 30 different types of coffee beans, make you 30 different types of coffee, and have you taste all of them. But through all those changes, there seems to be something that consistently holds and makes all these varieties and types of coffee, coffee. And the easy answer would be, well, it's because they're all coffee beans. But they're not all the same bean. They're all not all the same thing exactly, even though they're similar. So what is it? Where's that property? Where's that universal coffeeness that connects all these coffees? You want to say it's there because we're talking about coffee in a universal sense, but does it really exist? And it's the same thing for the color blue. We see it everywhere, but we never see it abstracted off of things in and of itself. And with what I would term here coffeeness, you see coffee, singular, lots and lots of different times in the various types of coffee you drink, the various types of coffee beans, and so on and so forth. But you never see this coffee plural or coffeeness abstracted off of the coffee itself. So how can we say that that is the case? So this core thing, this core idea, this essence of what coffee is, we could say that's what the universal of coffee is, if these universals actually exist. If it exists, it would be the essence that is common to all coffee, is found in all coffee, and without it, the coffee would no longer be coffee, it'd be something else. So this universal essence, and Aristotle sometimes referred to this as substance, depending on which part of Aristotle you read, it's the thing that makes coffee coffee. It is what gives coffee its definition, and without it, coffee just wouldn't be coffee. It would be something else. Now, to also help you understand this, we need to distinguish this substance or essence or universal of coffee from what we would call the accidents of coffee. A particular brand or type of coffee can be weak, strong, bland, bitter, or sweet, or many other things. These traits are what we would call accidents because they're accidental to the coffee, as any of them can be lost or changed, but the coffee will still be coffee. And in the example of blue, you can have different shades of blue. You can have it be lighter or darker, you can have it be blue-gray, you can have it be blue mixed with some other kind of color, and those are accidental properties because you can change them and it's still the color blue, or at least partially the color blue. Only when the change causes the thing or the coffee to cease to be coffee and become something else or just cease to be, has the substance or the essence been changed. It's possible to change bitter coffee to sweet coffee without causing it to no longer be coffee. Add some sugar, as lots of people do. Hence, the properties of being bitter or sweet are accidental rather than essential. And that's the principle you can keep in mind to distinguish between something that's an accidental property and something that's essential. If you can change it without changing the thing in and of itself, then it's accidental and not essential. Side note, this actually I think gives us a very, very good argument as to why gender is an essential property of human beings, because you can change a lot of properties about a human being that are accidental. You could make a person taller or shorter, make them fatter or thinner, stronger or weaker, more intelligent, less intelligent, and they'd still be the same person. You could even change my property of loving coffee, and I would still be Phil. I really do love coffee, but philosophically speaking, it's not essential to me that I love coffee. I could hate it and I'd still be Phil. But if you were to change me from a man to a woman, I'd be pretty fundamentally different. And that tells you that gender is essential. I don't think you could reasonably say that I would be the same person if you changed me to a woman from a man. So therefore, gender is an essential thing. It's not accidental, as some people claim. Now, the problem here is that it can be very, very hard to precisely pin down what exactly the essence of this thing is. What is this universal? The universal essence of coffee is that thing that is common to all instances of coffee, all the coffee we observe, and all this coffee shares it. The fact that I, and as best as I know every coffee drinker there is, can quickly determine what is and is not coffee when we drink it, this seems to demonstrate that there's something there, there's something substantial to this idea, because we can all observe this essence and go, yeah, that's coffee and that's not. We are able to recognize the taste and smell of coffee because we drank it before, and we recognize it when we're tasting and smelling the same thing that we did before. The problem here is not that I and other coffee drinkers are able to distinguish between coffee and other drinks that are not coffee, like water, soda, or scotch or something. It's how is it that we're able to do that? If there is something in common to all coffee, if there is a universal substance that's common to all coffee, this can easily lead into the trap of circular reasoning. The universal of coffee is based on the actual coffee we see and observe. Unfortunately, in turn, all of the actual coffee depends on the universal of coffee, term this coffeeness, and to get its coffeeness. The universal of coffeeness is itself derived from all the actual coffee, and very quickly there's an infinite regress of circular reasoning where we're using the one to refer back to the other all the time. So, where's the foundation? You want to try to find some type of foundation if you can anywhere. Essentially, the problem here is that the knowledge of coffee or coffeeness has to start somewhere, as nothing comes from nothing, per Aquinas, Aristotle, and every instance of good human reasoning there is. Nothing comes from nothing. So, the knowledge of this coffeeness cannot keep borrowing against itself by referring to the universal coffeeness, which refers to the actual instances of coffee, which in turn, again, refers back to the universal of coffeeness, and so on and so forth. And this is a relatively simple way of explaining the problem of universals. It seems, at least on the face of it, very reasonable and commonsensical to accept the existence of universals, as we just observe them everywhere, everyone does all the time. But there also doesn't seem to be a solid ontological or epistemological ground in which to base these universals, as they seem to just have to keep borrowing against themselves, and that leads to infinite regress pretty quickly. If universals do exist, then it seems that all knowledge is without foundation and hopelessly circular, which would be a big problem. And obviously I don't think that. If you've been listening to my podcast at all, you know that. So, what's the solution? Well, I'll get to that, but let me explain the problem a little bit more here. In effect, what this would mean is no one really knows anything about anything because there's no foundation, solid or even shaky, upon which to base our knowledge. Hence, it would seem, I don't actually know what coffee is, and neither does anyone else. Then it then seems that all knowledge is hopelessly circular, as universals seem to be in everything, and nearly all, if not all knowledge, is actually based on universals, which is a point I'll get to a bit later. An easy example of this is that nothing in contemporary science would be possible if universals were not true. The computer I'm working with right now only works in part because of the universal properties of, say, electrons and how they produce electricity. Okay, so while I was recording this yesterday, my daughter woke up and came out, so now I'm going to have to finish this today, i.e. the next day. So that's probably why you hear a difference in the background noise, because I had to get up early again to do this. So anyhow, getting back into it. It seems foolish and contrary to good reason, and an affront to all practical experience, to deny the existence of these universals. But at the same time, reason seems to force the grounding of these universals into circular reasoning, hence the problem. Now, there are good reasons to accept and affirm the existence of universals, that is, our own practical experience, the observations of everyone else, contemporary science, and so on. But if universals do exist, then there just doesn't really seem to be foundation for knowledge of those universals, and since pretty much everything we know is tied in universals, then no one really knows much of anything. I may think I'm drinking coffee, but it is really all nonsense, as there's no foundation for my knowledge of coffee. If, on the one hand, there is nothing apart from individual things, and the individual things are infinite or close to infinite in number, how then is it possible to get knowledge of the infinite individuals, i.e., If there really are only the individual instances of so many different types of coffee, how can I claim to have knowledge of what coffeeness is? Because I'll never be able to experience all of them. Even if I pooled my experience with other people, it'd still be very difficult at best to do. So the question is, does such a thing as the universal substance of, say, coffeeness exist? And if it doesn't exist, why does it appear to us like it does? And where does this knowledge of universals come from? How can we acquire knowledge of something that has no base, no foundation? If this coffeeness does exist, then the question is how the problem of infinite circularity can be sidestepped. So you've really got problems either way. If you want to turn around and deny the universals exist, then you've got the problem of explaining, well, why does it seem that way to everyone? And not just like in appearance like a mirage or something where we can explain, well, it seems that way, but it really isn't that way. But it seems that to everyone that things like the color blue and coffeeness and numbers actually exist. So why does it seem that way, and why does it seem that way in such a hard and fundamental way? But on the other hand, if you want to affirm that these things exist, then you've got the problem of circular reasoning and of whence from they came. What's the ontological foundation? So here are some of the proposed solutions to these problems, and there's been quite a few different proposed solutions, but they tend to take, roughly speaking, two different approaches, two different flavors, if you will. The nominalist will deny that such universalists exist, while the realist will affirm them. And sometimes under nominalists, you'll have people call themselves non-realist or anti-realists, and sometimes under realism, you'll have people call themselves Platonism falls under there, moderate realism falls under there, and there's a couple different flavors of each of these approaches. I learned a couple of years ago there's a variant of nominalism that only applies this solution to numbers, where they say, well, numbers don't exist, but every other universal you see or observe does exist. And there's, as I said, many different flavors of that. I'm not going to list them all here. My point is just to try to give you the two main categories. So the nominalist simply claims that only the individual things exist, and any universals are explained away as false, wrong, or some type of conception in the human mind that has no basis in reality. So you might hear them called useful fictions. The useful analogy that I come up with here, because I like role-playing games, is if you play a role-playing game either on a computer or a tabletop like Dungeons and Dragons or one of those other things where there's a set of rules and there's dice and everything like that, well, the rules in that game are useful fictions. They don't represent reality. It's not like you roll a dice in reality and have saving throws and things like that. So they're a useful fiction. They're a coherent way of doing things that makes sense in and of itself, but doesn't have a direct tie to reality. And nominalism, one way of looking at it at least, is that that's kind of how universals are. They're useful fictions that we find useful for getting by in our day-to-day lives, but they don't represent reality. So under nominalism, there is no coffeeness. There are only lots of individual instances of coffee. There is no color blue. There's only lots of things that have the color blue on them in some way. Now, the nominalist isn't denying the apparent similarities between many of the individual instances of coffee or the color blue. He's simply saying that these similarities are only apparent, and it doesn't follow from that there is an essential substance of the coffee that I drink every morning that's the same of the essential substance of every other coffee I drink every other day or the coffee I had yesterday. They did appear similar, but they are also distinct in some senses. They existed at different points in time. They contained different matter. And they were prepared differently, because despite my best efforts to prepare the same cup of coffee every morning, there's always slight variances. The temperature will be a little bit different. The amount of coffee and water and cream I use will be a little bit different every time, and so on and so forth. It's pretty much impossible that any cup of coffee I make is going to be exactly the same every time, or even the same way twice. Hence, the coffeeness was actually different. Now, this same critique, in some variant or other, can be applied to things like properties, classes, numbers, and other abstract entities that fall under the term universals. Hence, for the nominalist, the only legitimate claims are those that can be reduced to the status of an individual. Conceptualism is a variant of nominalism that attempts to solve this problem by arguing that, say, the universals only exist in the mind. Hence, a philosopher named Rosselinus, who I'm butchering the name again, sorry, he said, a universal is only a word, which is a great sum up of conceptualism. So if conceptualism is correct, then when I talk about coffee and the color blue and coffeeness, the idea of coffeeness, that is a substance or essence that is common to all coffee, only exists in my own mind. So if conceptualism is correct, then all universals are at best something like useful fictions. They are useful in that they help us all to see, understand, and conceptualize reality, but they at best only exist in our own minds. They are words without any referent in reality. But one of the problems that immediately comes in with this is if universals only exist in our minds and don't have a referent in reality, that is, when I talk about a table, it's very easy for you to see that has a referent in reality because there are tables everywhere. You can go to one, you can touch it, you can bang your fist on it, whatever. And that's what I mean here by it having a referent in reality. That's what people mean when they speak that way. Well, if no universal has a referent in reality, then, as I alluded to before, we've got a big problem because then pretty much all human knowledge is without foundation, without referent in reality. Because when you boil it down, pretty much all of our knowledge, or at least all of our useful knowledge, is dependent on universals. We take individual instances of things, abstract off of them the universals, and then apply that to the real world. That's how we do things like science and human reasoning. That's how we do philosophy. That's how we do pretty much all of our thinking. There's a few, you might be able to come up with a few exceptions, but generally speaking, that's how human reasoning works. So if you're going to say that the universals don't have a referent in reality, then you've got a real problem, because how can you really know that? Because you just made a universal statement about the universals, and hence you're stuck in that very popular skeptical paradox where you're saying, well, your knowledge doesn't really have a referent in reality, it's just a coherent system in your mind, like my Dungeons and Dragons example. And we don't really want to say that about our knowledge. We want our knowledge to be actually connected to reality. So the point here is that removing the infinite regress, as this nominalistic solution does, or this conceptualist solution does, it does stop the regress, but it just eliminates the foundation for all of knowledge. If there's no universal coffeeness, then how can I have a basis for my claim that what I drank yesterday and this morning, well, I haven't had my coffee yet this morning, but I will a little later, so how can I have a basis for my claim that the coffee I drank yesterday and the coffee I'm going to drink this morning are both coffee? If there is nothing connecting those two things, then my claim that what I drank yesterday and what I'll drink later today is coffee is at best too vague a claim to be sensible in any way. For as Aristotle said, for that which is non-existent cannot be known. Now, perhaps you can say that language just isn't precise enough to talk about these things in this fashion. Perhaps the universals exist only in my mind, or perhaps I'm just wrong when I talk about coffee. But the main problem I have with nominalism is no matter which route they want to take here to try to answer this objection, nominalism just seems to severely undercut the very possibility of knowledge. So, as Peter Kreeft and Trent Doherty said one time, nominalism seems logically self-contradictory. For if all trees are different, how can it be true to call them all trees? The very sentence that says all trees are not really the same presupposes that they are. And that's a handy way of summarizing this problem. Now, the other main route people take is the realist position, which affirms that universals do actually exist. Plato was a good example of this, or actually you might want to say he was the example of the realist tradition, as for Plato and the absolute realist tradition, universal essences have, as such, some kind of reality independent of the mind. There's something about them that's really, really out there. Plato's solution was to claim that there really is a universal form of coffee that somehow exists in another world, and all the coffee I drink and experience in reality is simply an imperfect reflection of that universal form. These are the Platonic forms, and while there are some variations and refinements of Plato's idea, there are still Platonists around, and there's like Neoplatonism and other things like that. But all of these generally follow the same notion that there's Platonic forms that exist in some way or in some sense, and that's the grounding and foundation for all the universals. There are really two realities. The perfect form of each universal exists in some type of, probably metaphysical realm, and everything that exists in the actual world is simply an imperfect expression of that perfect form. Now, this will solve the problem if you want to go with the realist route and claim that these universals actually exist, as then there is an actual universal thing, the perfect form of the coffeeness or the color blue or whatever, that exists independent of the actual individual coffees I drink. It exists in the Platonic form in whatever realm you want to put it in. And so then you've got a foundation. There's then a solid ground from which the actual coffee can take its definition and its essence, and hence no problem with my grounding my knowledge of it. I just need to refer back to the perfect form of coffeeness whenever I want to trace my knowledge back. However, Plato's theory here is not without its problems. In some senses, I think it's actually worse than nominalism. Aristotle was Plato's student, and he was also the first we have recorded of critic of Plato's theory here, and he was actually a very severe critic of it, according to the philosopher Anthony Kenny. Aristotle went so far as to say of this, the forms we can dispense with, for they are mere sound without sense, which is, it's harder to come up with a more biting critique of a theory than, they're just sound without sense. That's like that wonderful Shakespeare quote where he says, it's a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, but signifying nothing. And another quote from Peter Kreeft here where he summarizes just how problematic Platonic forms are. He says, this two-world theory seems fantastic to common sense, an example of what the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, treating an abstract aspect of a thing, its essential nature, as if it were another concrete thing. This theory of Plato's is sometimes called extreme realism because it claims that universals are extremely real, so to speak, just as real as individual things, in fact more real since they are timeless and immaterial and unchangeable. Now, there's also a further and perhaps even bigger problem with Platonism or extreme realism, which is how is it possible for these abstract forms in another metaphysical realm to cause or interact with anything in the actual world? How can these abstract ideas and objects actually cause or in any way cause dependency with something? So while Plato's forms do, in some senses, solve the problem of universals and allow for knowledge, it introduces other problems that seems to defy common sense, so it doesn't really seem to get us anywhere. So now you're probably wondering, is there a solution? You just said these are the two main ways you can go, and neither of them work. Well, yes, there is. Aristotle actually proposed a solution that I think that falls under the realist category, but I think kind of splits the difference between the two of them, and it's called moderate realism. So when he was explaining how the unmoved mover can think about itself, Aristotle draws a helpful distinction that's going to help us out here. He says that to be an act of thinking and to be an object of thought are not the same thing. Now, this is a very simple distinction that I think most of the nominalists miss. The thoughts that people have in their minds and the object of their thoughts are not identical. When a man thinks about a bike, the bike he is thinking about doesn't suddenly only exist in his mind and then cease to exist in the real world when he stops thinking about it. In effect, I think what the nominalists tend to get wrong is that they get the priority backwards, as they seem to argue that it's the people's thoughts that cause or identical with the objects of their thoughts. Now, common sense and Aristotle argue that it's the opposite that's true. It's things that cause our thoughts. So here's an extended analogy to try to help you get the point here. Consider the question of if democracy exists. Now, at first, it might seem obvious that it does, as there's numerous democratic and republic governments that exist. But where is this democracy located? Now, it should be pretty difficult to point to a location or substance and say, there it is, there's democracy. I mean, if you could point to the U.S. Capitol building, but that's not really democracy. I mean, it would be entirely possible that in 10 or 20 years, say, somebody manages to overthrow the U.S. government and they still use the U.S. Capitol as a base for their tyrannical government. So maybe you could say things like the U.S. Capitol is a symbol of democracy, but it's not democracy in and of itself. So now, let's try taking another step back and consider individual instances of democracy like the U.S. government. Now, I think it would seem pretty foolish to argue that the U.S. government doesn't exist. After all, it's doing things all the time. We're paying taxes to it, and if it doesn't exist, we're paying taxes to nothing. Right now, in the middle of this pandemic, it's making lots of people stay home and lots of businesses close. So is nothing making lots of people stay home and lots of businesses close? Well, no, I don't think so. That's pretty foolish. But where is the U.S. government substantiated? And if you want to say it's in Washington, D.C., where is it in D.C.? If you then want to turn around and say it's in things like, say, the U.S. Capitol building, the White House, the U.S. Supreme Court, and other government buildings there, well, then where is it in those buildings? Can you actually go into some of those buildings and physically touch and experience the U.S. government? The point here is that that's an impossible thing to do. Now, I know some people might want to object that you can experience the U.S. government by simply failing to pay your taxes and then watching what happens when they come after you and throw you in jail. But an objection like that, it misses the point I'm driving at here. It is possible to experience and interact with, say, some aspects or representation of the U.S. government, but never the actual whole. While failing to pay my taxes may lead to me experiencing law enforcement in the criminal justice system, I still don't have direct experience of, say, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Education, or the numerous other government agencies and departments. The point I'm making here is that it's impossible to find and experience the whole actual U.S. government, or a whole and actual democracy. Representations of it can be experienced, but it's impossible to experience the entire thing, at least for one person at the same time. And this is an analogy, so don't carry it out too far. But likewise, it's possible for me to experience an individual instance of coffee when I drink it, but it's not possible for me to experience the whole of coffeeness, every instance of coffee, all the time, at the same way, or even every individual instance of coffee in my lifetime, as there's way too much of it I could never experience at all. So when I describe it that way, the government sounds a little suspiciously like a universal. After all, the trouble with the universals is that, while individual instances of them are observed and experienced, the whole is notoriously elusive. While there are lots of individual instances to point to, where is the blue? Where is the coffeeness? Where is the U.S. government? Well, some might want to turn around and say blue is only a word. It's much, much harder to do that about, say, the U.S. government, because it just doesn't make sense to say, that's only a word. There's no connection in reality about it. Sensible people aren't just going to pay taxes or lock themselves in their homes due to only a word. Now, a second key distinction that we get from Aristotle and other places solves this problem, and that's that mental processes can and do picture things differently than those things exist. Everyone recognizes this when they first play make-believe as a child. Hence, properties of things can be abstracted off of things in the real world and then imagined separately. I can see the color blue on a car and then imagine the blue separate from the car itself. Now, it's harder to do that with coffeeness, but the principle is still the same. It's quite possible to imagine what a person would look like with, say, a different haircut, what a building would look like if we painted it a different color, or what a room looks like if the furniture is arranged differently. But this process doesn't just stop with tangible things. So while the color blue never exists in the real world separate from something else, for something to be blue, there must be a car, a building, or something else there. It is possible, and even natural and good, for the mind to abstract the blue off the physical thing in the world and consider the blue in and of itself. Blue will never exist in and of itself in reality, just as things like shape, size, weight, morality, democracy, coffeeness, and other colors will also never exist in and of themselves in reality. But our mind gives us the power to consider these things separate from the individual instances that we see them, and that mental image is an image of what exists out there. These things do exist in the world only as individual things, but they then exist in our minds as universal concepts when the mind abstracts them from these things. And loosely speaking, this is moderate realism, which, while it falls under the realist camp, I think kind of splits the difference between nominalism and realism and takes the best points of both and avoids most of the problems of both. So Aristotle wrote a great deal about the problem of universals in Metaphysics. That's where he gave this, or proposed this solution of moderate realism. And he said there, the universal causes then of which we spoke do not exist, for it is the individual that is the originative principle of the individuals. For Aristotle, forms are not separate. Any form is the form of some actual individual, and there it's referring to forms in that Platonic sense. Hence, due to a few clever distinctions he draws out, Aristotle's able to find a middle way through the epistemological and ontological mess that the Platonists and nominalists get lost in. Aristotle, as usual, takes a middle position between these two extremes, and his view accords best with common sense. It is called moderate realism, and it holds that essences are objectively real, contrary to the nominalists, but not real things, contrary to Platonists or extreme realism. Aristotle's position is that both Plato and the nominalists are partially right and partially wrong. Plato and the Platonists are correct in arguing that universals are real things that actually exist, but he's wrong in thinking that they are tangible or what Aristotle would call substances. That is, universals aren't like the table example. They aren't a real thing that we can just experience and touch in the real world the same way we can a table. The nominalists are right in arguing that a universal is a mental object or an abstract of the mind, but they are wrong in arguing that there is nothing in reality upon which universals are based. Universals are words, but they are not just words. The gist of the matter is that a universal cannot exist by itself, but only in particular things. Now, my analogy of the U.S. government does kind of fall apart eventually. The U.S. government is not a true universal in the sense that, say, blue or coffeeness is. If a person were, say, big enough and powerful enough, or if you shrunk the government small enough, it would be possible to experience the whole of the government. You could do it. But it's not possible to do that with the color blue. Yet, I'd say the government is a useful analogy here for explaining how universals work, as the U.S. government is grounded in its citizens, similar to how the universal of blue is grounded in the actual instances of blue. At least a republic or democratic government is grounded in that way. Just as a government cannot exist without its citizens, so a universal cannot be abstracted without the actual individual instances of that universal. That is, you can't abstract the color blue off of the individual instance of the color blue without first seeing blue out somewhere. You can't have the abstract of the universal of coffeeness without there being actual coffee in the world. Concrete things are ultimate realities because if they did not exist, nothing else would exist either. Now, this problem of universals is, as you can see, can get very technical and quite abstract, but it's actually also quite important, as I'll explain here. I think things like this are often where people will somewhat unjustly go and say, well, philosophy is just questioning, like, if you can even know things, man. And it's just like a bunch of philosophers sitting around and going, is that table really there? And after I've explained this, you can see, well, there's a little bit of basis for that, although that's kind of a gross misrepresentation of it, but there's a little bit of basis, because that's what we're really questioning is, well, what's the foundation for all these things? But it actually matters a great deal where you come down on this, because if, say, something like Platonic forms are correct, then all individuals are merely pale and pathetic copies of the universals. Hence, individuals are then not very important. Conversely, if nominalism is true, then, as I argued before, much, if not all, of knowledge is undercut and only varying degrees of skepticism are possible. Now, nominalists will object to that. I've read some of them doing that, but I think that is the case. And here's some other examples of how this is actually pretty important. I recall when I was in college, a philosophy professor there was trying to get me to agree with the idea that things like corporations and collections of individuals, like, say, a company that exists that's a collection of all the individuals working for a common goal, he was saying, those don't really exist. We treat them like we do, but they're not. And I think you should immediately be able to see how that ties right back into the problem of universals, because what he was in a sense doing was taking the nominalistic position and applying it to something practical in the real world and saying, well, yeah, corporations don't really exist. They're a useful fiction that allows us to, so to speak, pool our resources, but the corporation isn't really there. You can't go physically find it and touch it and experience it. And I remember a few years back when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that for the purposes of free speech, corporations are to be treated as persons. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court was arguing differently. They're saying we're treating corporations as if they are a real thing. And that philosophy professor who I was talking to in college was saying, yeah, but they're not. They're not. Even though we sometimes have to act like they are, they're not. A corporation's a useful fiction. The Supreme Court more or less said, no, we're taking a realist position on corporations. Or, conversely, I know I've beat up on nominalism in this quite a bit because I do think it undermines the foundations of human knowledge, but one of the best arguments there is for nominalism, and this has been advanced by many philosophers, and William Lane Craig took a similar position to this, although he didn't call it nominalism for obvious reasons. But the problem that you're going to run into if you want to go my route is, well, some abstract objects like numbers seem to just kind of exist necessarily in and of themselves. It's hard to imagine any type of universe or world that could exist where there isn't numbers in some sense. Even if there's only one thing there, the number 2 could still exist in a universe with only one thing because it's an abstract thing. All numbers seem to exist all the time. Well, the problem with that, if you're a Christian theist like me, is then it seems like you've got an abstract thing existing necessarily that's not God, that's separate and apart from God. And you clearly don't want that if you're a Christian theist like me. And that, although I haven't looked at his work in this extensively, is I think why Craig actually came down and took a more nominalistic position, is because he didn't want to say, well, there's these abstract things that exist apart and separate from God, and he didn't see a way around that other than going with a more nominalist position. So that's a pretty big problem or issue if you're a Christian theist like me and want to assert some type of realism, as I do. And I'll fully admit here that, well, I need to do some more study, research, and thinking about this. I don't have a good answer to that problem yet. I think there probably is one, but in this case, what I'm doing, why I come down on moderate realism, is I'm trying to compare the objections, be like, well, there's this somewhat abstract and somewhat technical objection that if some type of moderate realism is right, then it seems like numbers and a few other abstract things might exist independently of God, and I don't want that. Or I look at what I think nominalism does to human knowledge and how if there are no universals, then all of our knowledge is without referent in the real world, and I'm like, well, I think that's a much, much bigger problem than this problem of maybe, perhaps, numbers might be existing necessarily by themselves. So that's why I go with moderate realism when I'm comparing the two, because it seems like the problems you run into with a type of nominalism are much, much more severe than the problems you run into with a type of moderate realism. So the solution I like here is, as I said, moderate realism, and it's allowed for by key distinctions that Aristotle makes between things like the existence of universals and our knowledge of them. As conceptions of universals are abstracted for all the individual things we encounter, and knowledge is described in terms of the identity of the knower and the thing known, no one's conception of a universal will ever be absolutely certain, but absolute certainty isn't required for knowledge. That's a common mistake people make that I'll probably try and talk about sometime in the coming episodes. So Aristotle saw quite clearly, even in his day, that the data gathered by the senses must be related by means of common sense or intellect before they are actually known. Aristotle's moderate realism solves this problem of universals, more or less, and preserves the possibility of knowledge. So as I said when I got started doing this problem is a very, very key and important distinction in philosophy. It's a bit oversimplistic to do this, but you can actually, in some senses, divide a lot of philosophy into whether it takes a nominalistic route or a realistic route. So philosophers like, say, Kant and Hume would be much more nominalistic, where guys like Aquinas, Aristotle, and Plato would be much more realistic. And that's not always a completely fair way to divide philosophy, because many people tried to toe the middle or go back and forth. I think somebody said one time about Bertrand Russell that there's no philosophical position that existed that he didn't at one point in time take. But at the same time, it's a useful way of thinking about these things and recognizing why these philosophers seem to be saying something so radically different than these other ones. And much of that will go back to their solution to the problem of universals. And that's why it's an important thing for you to think about and understand and try to work your way through if you're trying to do good philosophy. And there are those practical real-world examples like, well, do you think a corporation is just a useful fiction, or do you think there's actually something real and tangible there? How you answer that question will actually, I think, determine a great deal about what you want to do with corporations in a political and social and practical sense. So that's my podcast for this week. By all means, write in, let me know what you think. You can always reach me for any kind of comment or critique or question at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or leave a comment, send me a message at the Facebook group I created for the podcast. Now, I haven't been updating the Facebook page as much as I should, because it's very, very difficult to get things done when you've got two kids who are just screaming all the time. That's just the way it is at my house right now because of the age of my children. As I said, I had to get up like an hour and a half, actually more like an hour and 45 minutes early, 2 days in a row to even get this done. And even then they interrupted me probably like 3 or 4 times. So I'm going to do my best, keep trying to muddle through. In that vein, I'm actually going to be moving to doing this as a bi-weekly podcast instead of an every week one, because I'm just having, as everyone who listens knows, a horrendous time keeping up with it, with all the distractions and interruptions that are coming with being stuck in a house with 2 kids that are so young who require so much attention all the time. So I'm going to be moving to a bi-weekly podcast, I think, starting this week, so it'll be actually 2 weeks before I get out another one, and hopefully that'll also increase the quality of my podcasts, as it'll give me a little bit more time to get them out, and I won't have missed weeks like I did last week. So again, my apologies for missing last week. It is entirely due to how chaotic and crazy it is in my house with having kids who are so young and them having to be stuck in the house or around the house all day with the pandemic. They just require so much attention, as every parent with young children knows. In fact, there goes one of them crying in their room right now. So I will end this now. Thanks as always for listening. I appreciate it, and I will be back to talk to you again in 2 weeks' time.
Hi there, this is Christine Mooney Flynn, host of the Catholic Mama podcast, and I'd like to invite you to join me over on the Catholic Mama. To develop a Christian family and raise children who are, and who, God willing, will continue to be confident Catholics, requires us as parents to be confident in our faith as well. So each week, I dive into topics that help to make sense of the Catholic faith and how to live out that faith in our vocation as husbands and wives, moms and dads. So whether you need help in explaining aspects of Catholic doctrine like the real presence in the Eucharist, or if you're looking for practical ideas on how to live a more Catholic life, my goal is that you'll find the answers and guidance you're looking for over on my show, The Catholic Mama. I hope to see you there.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.